Good morning, friends. There is a time for everything. The winds change, the leaves fall, and the ground rests before spring bursts forth. Just as nature follows a divine rhythm, so do our lives. You may feel a shift, an inner stirring, a call to step forward. That is no accident. God is leading you into a new season. God's timing is perfect. Life moves in seasons, each one set in place by divine wisdom. There are moments of planting and moments of harvest, times of growth and times of rest. Nothing happens outside of God's appointed time. Even when it feels like life is at a standstill, God is working beneath the surface, preparing something far greater than we can imagine. Often we are eager for change or anxious for what's next, yet God operates on His own timeline, not ours. In Bible we are said that everything has a season and a purpose under heaven. This means that delays are not denials, and waiting is never wasted. When we feel stuck or uncertain, it does not mean God has forgotten us. It means He is shaping us, aligning circumstances and strengthening our faith so that when the new season arrives, we are ready to step into it fully. Consider Joseph. He was given dreams of greatness, visions of leadership and purpose, but before those dreams were fulfilled, he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. It must have seemed at times that everything was moving in the opposite direction of God's promise. Yet, in every moment, whether in the pit, the prison, or the palace, God was preparing him. Each delay, each trial, was not an obstacle, but a necessary part of the process. When the right time came, Joseph was not just positioned for leadership, he was prepared for it. God's timing is not just about events aligning, it is about our hearts being made ready. Sometimes we long for a new season while still carrying the burdens of the old one. But God in His wisdom knows when we are truly ready to step forward. In Bible we are said that God makes everything beautiful in its time. This tells us that what may look incomplete or confusing now will in time be seen as part of a greater masterpiece. Impatience can make us doubt, but trust reminds us that God sees the whole picture. A seed does not become a tree overnight. There is a process, hidden growth, deepening roots, unseen transformation. Likewise, when God leads us into a new season, He ensures we are deeply rooted in faith before we step forward. Abraham and Sarah were promised a child, yet years passed before the promise was fulfilled. Their waiting was not a mistake, it was a time of trust, a season of learning to depend not on their own understanding, but on God's faithfulness. The fulfillment of the promise was not just about the birth of a child, but about revealing the nature of a God who always keeps His word. When God moves, He does so in perfect harmony with His purpose. He is never too early, never too late. Though we may not always understand the timing, we can trust that every delay has meaning. Every waiting season has purpose, and when the moment is right, He will open the door no one can shut. Letting go of the old is one of the hardest things to do. We find comfort in what is familiar, even when God is calling us into something new. There is a natural tendency to hold on to past seasons, whether they were filled with joy or pain, because they feel safe. But when God leads us into a new chapter, we cannot fully embrace what He is doing if our hands are still holding on to what was. In Bible we are said to forget the former things and not dwell on the past. because God is doing a new thing. This is not a call to erase memories or disregard experiences, but to release the weight of yesterday so that we can step into the promise of today. The story of the Israelites is a powerful reminder of how difficult it can be to move forward. After being delivered from Egypt, they still longed for what was behind them. Even though they had been enslaved, they clung to the familiarity of Egypt because the wilderness was uncertain. God was leading them to a land flowing with milk and honey, but their hearts were still tied to the past. This struggle delayed their journey, turning what should have been a short transition into a long and painful process. In the same way, holding on to what God has asked us to release can delay His blessings. He calls us to trust that what is ahead is far greater than what we leave behind. Sometimes what we hold on to is not just past success or comfort, but wounds and disappointments. Painful experiences have a way of anchoring us to the past, making it difficult to move forward. We replay conversations, revisit hurts, and build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves. But in Bible we are said to cast our burdens on the Lord because He cares for us. Carrying old burdens into a new season only weighs us down. When God calls us forward, He also calls us to healing. He does not simply want to change our circumstances, He wants to transform our hearts. Even Jesus spoke about the necessity of letting go. He said that new wine cannot be poured into old wineskins, or else they will burst. The message is clear. God cannot pour new blessings into a heart that is still clinging to the past. The old wineskins represent outdated ways of thinking, past experiences, and even relationships that no longer align with where God is leading us. He desires to do something fresh, but we must be willing to make room for it. Abraham had to leave his homeland without knowing where he was going. The disciples had to leave their nets to follow Jesus. Paul had to leave behind his past identity to walk in his divine calling. In every case, the act of releasing what was opened the door to something greater. What we hold on to may feel significant, but what God has prepared is always beyond what we can imagine. Faith over fear is the choice that determines how we step into a new season. Fear whispers that the unknown is dangerous, that change is risky, and that staying where we are is safer. Faith, on the other hand, calls us to trust what we cannot yet see, to believe that God's plan is greater than our fears. Fear will always try to keep us where we are, but faith moves us forward into what God has prepared. In Bible we are said that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. This means that fear does not come from God, and if He is leading us into something new, He has already provided the strength to walk through it. The story of Peter walking on water is a perfect example of how faith and fear battle within us. When Jesus called Peter out of the boat, he stepped forward with faith. As long as his eyes were on Jesus, he did what seemed impossible. He walked on water. But the moment he focused on the wind and waves, fear took over and he began to sink. Jesus reached out and saved him, but he also asked, "Why did you doubt?" The lesson is clear. Faith keeps us steady, but fear causes us to sink. Every new season requires a step of faith, and the only way to walk forward is to keep our eyes on Jesus rather than the storms around us. The Israelites faced this same test when they stood before the Promised Land. 12 spies were sent to explore the land, and while all of them saw the same reality, their perspectives were completely different. 10 saw giants and declared that it was impossible to move forward. 2 saw the same giants, but remembered God's promise and declared that with him victory was certain. The people allowed fear to overtake them, and because of their unbelief, they wandered in the wilderness instead of entering the land God had already prepared for them. In Bible we are said that without faith it is impossible to please God. When we let fear dictate our decisions, we delay the blessings He wants to give us. Faith does not mean we will never feel afraid. It means we choose to trust God despite our fear. Joshua was told repeatedly to be strong and courageous, not because he was naturally fearless, but because God was with him. The same promise applies to us. Every great move of God begins with a step of faith. Whether it was Noah building the ark before the rain came, David facing Goliath with only a sling, or Mary believing she would carry the Savior. In every case, faith moved them forward, and God's power met them in their obedience. Fear looks at the size of the obstacle. Faith looks at the greatness of God. Fear focuses on what could go wrong. Faith focuses on the one who never fails. Fear paralyzes, but faith moves forward, knowing that if God is leading, there is nothing to fear. God's guidance is unfailing. He does not lead his people into uncertainty without purpose, nor does he call them forward without a plan. Every step he directs is intentional, even when the path is unclear. In Bible, we are said that the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. This means that even when we cannot see the full picture, God has already mapped out the way. He does not make mistakes, and he never abandons those who trust in him. Abraham was called to leave his homeland and go to a place that God would show him. He did not have all the details, no map, no visible confirmation, just a promise. Yet, by faith he followed. It was not an easy journey. There were moments of uncertainty, trials, and waiting, but at every stage God proved faithful. The fulfillment of the promise was not just in reaching the destination, but in how God shaped him along the way. Sometimes the process is just as important as the promise. God's guidance is not just about where we are going, but about who we are becoming as we follow him. The Israelites experienced this same truth when they left Egypt. God did not lead them on the shortest route, though one was available. Instead, he guided them through the wilderness with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. This was a visible reminder that he was with them, going ahead of them, never leaving them to navigate alone. In Bible we are said that God goes before his people and makes the crooked places straight. Even when the road seems difficult or confusing, he is already clearing the way, making provision, and ensuring that we arrive at the right place at the right time. There are moments when God's direction requires waiting. Waiting is one of the hardest parts of following his guidance, because it feels like nothing is happening. But even in the waiting, he is working. Joseph was given dreams of leadership, yet he spent years in slavery and prison before stepping into his calling. What seemed like delays were actually seasons of preparation. In Bible we are said that those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. God's timing is perfect, and his guidance never fails, even when it does not align with our expectations. Sometimes God's leading takes us through storms. The disciples were in a boat when a storm arose, and they feared for their lives. But Jesus was with them. and at his word the storm was silenced. They were never outside of his care, even when the waters raged around them. In Bible we are said that though we walk through the valley, we should fear no evil, because he is with us. No matter how uncertain the journey feels, his presence is constant, his direction is sure, and his promises are unshakable. God never misguides, and when we follow him, we are always on the right path. Growth comes through transition. Every change, every shift, every new season is an opportunity for spiritual maturity. It is in moments of transition that faith is tested, trust is deepened, and character is refined. God does not lead his people into something new just for the sake of change. He leads them because there is something greater ahead, something that requires a stronger, wiser, and more prepared version of who they are today. In Bible we are said that trials produce perseverance, and perseverance produces character. The process of moving from one season to another is not just about reaching a destination, it is about being transformed along the way. When the Israelites left Egypt, they were no longer slaves, but they did not yet know how to live as free people. The wilderness was not a punishment, it was preparation. God used that season to teach them trust, to reshape their identity, and to prepare them for the blessings of the Promised Land. Had they gone straight from Egypt to Canaan, they would have carried a slave mindset into a land meant for conquerors. Growth had to take place before they could step into the fullness of God's promise. In the same way, every transition in life is an opportunity to shed old ways of thinking, to let go of habits that no longer serve us, and to embrace the new identity God is forming within us. David was anointed as king long before he sat on the throne, but there was a journey between the calling and the fulfillment. He faced battles, betrayals, and seasons of hiding, but each experience was shaping him for the role he was destined to step into. In Bible we are said that God refines his people like silver, testing them in the furnace of affliction. Growth is not always comfortable, but it is necessary. Without the struggles, David would not have developed the wisdom, the resilience, or the heart needed to lead a nation. What felt like delays were actually divine training sessions, ensuring that when the time came, he would be ready. Jesus himself went through seasons of growth. Though he was the Son of God, he spent years in preparation before stepping into public ministry. Even after his baptism, he was led into the wilderness, where he fasted and was tested before launching into his divine assignment. In Bible, we are said that even the Son learned obedience through what he suffered. If Jesus, who was perfect, went through a process of preparation, how much more should we embrace the seasons of growth God places before us? Every transition has a purpose. The challenges we face in a new season are not signs that we are on the wrong path. They are signs that God is stretching us, teaching us, and molding us into the people He has called us to be. It is through transition that faith is strengthened, wisdom is gained, and we are made ready for the next level of God's plan. A new season requires obedience. When God calls His people forward, He expects them to follow, even when the path is unclear. Obedience is not just about hearing His voice, but acting on it, stepping forward in faith, even when logic or emotions resist. In Bible we are said that to obey is better than sacrifice. This means that God values our willingness to follow Him more than any offering or ritual we could bring. True obedience is trusting that His way is higher, that His plan is greater and that He sees what we cannot. Noah was given instructions to build an ark at a time when there was no sign of rain. Every action he took required obedience to something unseen. He followed God's word, despite the doubts of those around him, despite the fact that the task was enormous, despite not knowing when the flood would come. His obedience saved his family and preserved God's plan. Obedience is not about convenience. It is about trust. In Bible, we are said that faith without works is dead. If Noah had believed in God's warning but refused to build, his faith would have been meaningless. Faith is proven through action, and action requires obedience. Abraham was told to sacrifice the son he had waited decades for. It made no sense, yet he obeyed. At the last moment, God provided a ram in place of Isaac, proving that the test was not about losing his son, but about trusting God's plan above his own understanding. In the Bible, we are said that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His ways are beyond ours. There will be moments when obedience does not make sense, when God asks for surrender without showing what comes next. It is in those moments that true faith is revealed. When Jesus called His disciples, they had to leave everything immediately. Peter, James, and John walked away from their fishing nets, their source of income, their daily routine, without knowing exactly where Jesus would lead them. Matthew left his tax booth, abandoning the security of his position to follow a rabbi who had no earthly wealth. Every act of obedience carried a cost, but it also carried a greater reward. In Bible, we are said that whoever loses their life for God's sake will find it. Obedience often requires letting go of something familiar to receive something far greater. The rich young ruler came to Jesus seeking eternal life, but when he was asked to give up his wealth and follow, he walked away sad. He wanted the blessing, but could not surrender what was required. Obedience is a test of the heart. It reveals whether we truly trust God's goodness or if we are still holding on to control. When God calls, delaying is disobedience. Partial obedience is still disobedience. The ones who walk into the fullness of God's promises are those who trust Him enough to follow without hesitation, knowing that every act of obedience leads to something greater than they could imagine. Every new season God leads us into is filled with purpose, growth, and transformation. Though change can be uncertain, His timing is perfect, His guidance is unfailing, and His plans are always for our good. Letting go of the past, stepping forward in faith, and trusting His direction are all necessary to embrace what He has prepared. Fear may try to hold us back, but obedience moves us forward. In Bible, we are said that God knows the plans He has for us. Plans to prosper us, not to harm us, to give us hope and a future. Every transition is an invitation to trust Him more deeply, to grow in faith, and to walk boldly into His promises. As we step into this new season, may we surrender completely, follow wholeheartedly, and believe that God's purpose will always lead us to something greater than we could ever imagine.